This is the story of the Snowtown Barrel Murders that occurred between 1992 and 1999 in Snowtown, which is in South Australia, or at least that's where the bodies were disposed of. A couple of warnings before I begin. This story deals with sensitive issues such as child sex abuse, animal abuse, graphic murder, and torture. I tried to not go overboard with describing the details in this story, but you should be warned. These guys were pretty brutal. Also, this is not a feel-good revenge story. The killers in this story claimed they were ridding the world of pedophiles, but the people they actually killed likely were no such thing, with the exception of two. I just want to make that clear. So that being said, let's get into it. John Justin Bunting was born on September 4th, 1966 in the town of Innilan, which is in Queensland, South Australia. He was born with no sense of smell and missing most of his sense of taste, but other than that, his parents viewed him as the perfect baby. He grew up in a happy home, and John was a happy kid. He would spend a fair amount of time playing with friends, and life was good. Or it was up until he was 8 years old. It was summer break, and John was playing at his friend's house. They were down in a cool basement, avoiding the unbearable heat outside. When John had come over, he had no idea that his whole life was going to be turned upside down, and he would be tortured. It began when the friend's 13-year-old brother showed up at the basement with some rope. Without any provocation, he began striking John in the head with his fists. John never saw it coming and hadn't really been in fights before, so he didn't know what to do. The teen started punching at John's testicles. John would scream out, but there would be nobody there that would be able to come to his aid. John's friend had already been punched out by his own brother. The sadistic teen dragged John by his hair over to a fold-out bed in the corner of the basement. From there, he would slap John around some more before pulling his pants down. John's feet were tied and his arms tied behind his back. There was no escape, and he would have to endure agony from this twisted kid. The kid used his fingers on John before sodomizing him. Part of the time the teen would laugh, and part of the time he would call John names angrily, saying anything and everything to make this experience all the more worse for John. John was crying out in utter despair and would try to resist, but this abuse would go on for hours, and John would have no fight left in him. John would try to go somewhere else in his own mind, but it was hard. Hard when he was hurting him, biting him, saying, "Yeah, you like that, you little faggot." John would eventually be let go, but he would never be the same after that. His innocence was gone, taken, his soul indefinitely crushed. He got in trouble that night for getting home so late, but he couldn't even muster the strength to tell his own parents what happened to him. He wasn't going to relive the shame. John would ultimately shut down after that. He didn't really speak to his parents much. Their once loving relationship was now over. John withdrew from everything and everybody, and he would run into his attacker at school sometimes, who would laugh and point at him. The teen pulled John aside one day and threatened to do it again if John told anyone. John stared at the teen. John wasn't afraid of him anymore. What more could he do to him? John had a lot of anger towards rapists that we all have, and with John, soon the anger would be released. John had a hate burning in his gut. This was starting to weigh heavily on him, and he felt like everybody knew what happened to him. If someone would look at him and smile, he would be paranoid that they were told about the horrific thing that happened to him, and he started to question himself. There were moments during the torture that felt somewhat pleasurable to him. What did that say about himself? Did he like it? The thoughts made him sick with fury. But he wouldn't take out his frustrations on other people. He would start with animals. What started out as melting ants with magnifying glasses would escalate to capturing stray cats and dogs that he would squeeze the life out of. Later in life, he would work at a slaughterhouse. It would be one of the only straight jobs that he ever held, and he had a sick fascination in taking the lives of animals and opening them up. And as he killed them, he thought of the sick predators that raped him as a child. At the age of 13, John was skipping school and not talking to his parents. He didn't have a lot of friends. He spent a lot of time out late alone in the park. That's where he met Benny. Benny was a man in his 30s who could easily manipulate the young teen, but not in the way you might think. Benny was a white supremacist who preached the word of neo-Nazis. He would tell John about the enemies that he would have to watch out for, the inferior ones. They would consist of drug dealers, aboriginals, disabled people, and individuals of the Asian race. Oh, and also homosexuals. John saw homosexuals and pedophiles as one and the same. John saw them as the most evil predators. But now he would flip the script on them. John and Benny would go to local gay hotspots where John would be used as bait. When John lured a non-suspecting gay man to hook up with out in the alley, Benny would pop out. The duo would stomp the mark and they would rob him. And John had been working out and had a pretty big build for his age, so he was definitely inflicting some pain on their intended target. And this was a pedophile who was trying to hook up with an underage teen. They were getting exactly what they deserved. This would go on for quite some time, but by the age of 16 he started to mug people less. He started to try to be more social. He would make friends, go to parties, and started to have intimate relationships with girls. He would still hang out with Benny. Benny was like a father to him, and John very much cared for him. And it really hit him hard when Benny got sick. Benny had throat cancer. John would stay with Benny at the hospital until the bitter end, when one day Benny went to sleep and never woke up again. His second father was gone, and John had to get away. He would end up dropping out of school and leaving town with some friends to start a new life. There was no drawn-out goodbyes to his parents. They didn't even know their son at this point. A group of 6 of them found the town of Adelaide to settle in. They found various apartments to room in which some would room together. John would first work at a crematorium. He had no issues with working around dead people. As mentioned earlier, he would go on to working at a slaughterhouse. His friends and roommates thought this was kind of odd. John didn't bat an eye at slitting the throat of an animal, and he was being paid very well for it. John's roommate Kevin and his girlfriend had a dog of their own, and John and the 4-legged creature seemed to not get along too well with each other. One day when John was home alone with the animal, there was an incident that happened. I'm not going to go into much details, but it involved the use of a blowtorch. Kevin and his girlfriend came home to a horrifying scene. John didn't give much of an explanation. He just sat there and said there was an accident with the blowtorch. Kevin and his girlfriend were speechless. They didn't realize what kind of person their friend was, and they moved out shortly after. John would be an avid reader of neo-Nazi magazines. He would tend to order a lot of different guns by mail on the backs of these magazines. He started to take night classes at the local community college, where he met Vanessa. They really hit it off. John was really intelligent and very well spoken, and she found herself drawn to him. She saw big things for him in the future, and they would end up marrying in a matter of months after they began dating. The newlywed couple would move just outside Adelaide to the suburb of Southbury North. It was plagued by drugs and poverty, but John was happy to acquire a bungalow that was dirt cheap. Many residents of the neighborhood were unemployed, and most were on disability. John despised the disabled and saw them as inferior with low intelligence. He also saw them as people that could be easily manipulated. But in the end, these inferiors were no better than homosexuals or pedophiles, and he would set out to meet his neighbors to see if he could find some allies among the bunch. John would find an unlikely pair when he met neighbors Barry Lane and Robert Wagner. Barry Lane was a man in his 30s who had served time in prison for abusing 2 12-year-old boys. He would dress in women's clothes and go by the name Vanessa, but I would refer to him as Barry just to keep things simple. Barry's boyfriend was 19-year-old Robert Wagner, but they had been together since Robert was only 13. Robert had grown up in a house of horrors. He was abused at home his whole life and tried to kill himself at a young age, so he found comfort in Barry, not fully grasping that Barry was indeed a predator. And Robert's parents really didn't give a shit that Robert was hardly ever home, and that he was being abused by this transgendered sex offender. John became fast friends with both of them. He saw himself in Robert, and knew he could talk him into believing the same ideologies that he himself believed. That homosexuals/pedophiles were the evil force among them that must be eradicated. But John always played nice with Barry, which wasn't always an easy thing to do. Barry was loud and crude, and he would seem to test John by kissing Robert while looking and smiling at him. Or he would say inappropriate sexual things just to see how uncomfortable he could make John. And John would just put on a smile and act like he was totally cool with all of it. Wife Veronica was very surprised by John's reaction because she knew how John felt about homosexuals. But when they left and Veronica looked at John regarding Barry, John said, "Don't worry, he'll get his." John befriended many neighbors, and he was all too happy to go on political rants, which mainly focused on his hatred of pedophiles or homosexuals, which he believed were the same thing. One man was Mark Hayden, who would be a future co-defendant of John. They would hang out, drink beer, and Mark would be very receptive of John's political leanings. He also met Suzanne Allen, who collected disability benefits. She rented a section of her home to a man named Ray Davies, who was mentally handicapped and also collected benefits. He had the intelligence of a child, but he would have regular sex with this landlady. Another man who would have a budding relationship with John was Clinton Trezise. Although they were really close, Clinton was not really buying into all of John's big talk, and it would ultimately cost him his life. While the rest of John's friends would eagerly listen to John talk and hang on his every word, Clinton would sometimes duck out when John started going on one of his rants about pedophiles and gays. Clinton was not easily manipulated, and he didn't want to belong to some weird cult. Why couldn't they just hang out and drink and shoot the shit like normal people? On August 31st, 1992, John was hanging out with Barry and Robert. John was feeling a lot of rage bubbling inside him. He had abruptly just stopped going to work at the slaughterhouse. Taking the lives of animals just wasn't satisfying him anymore. And the thought of weak people and pedophiles consumed his mind. Clinton showed up to hang out while John was grandstanding. Clinton made a face like, "Oh, here we go again." And it got John so heated, he accused Clinton of being a pedophile. Clinton told him to fuck off. And John fucked off, but soon came back with a shovel. John looked into Barry's eyes as he proceeded to bash Clinton in the head with it. Robert was horrified, and Barry did not see this coming either. They were forced to help John get rid of the body, and John felt good about the situation. He just rid the world of one less pedophile. Nobody would come looking for Clinton, and his body wouldn't be discovered for another 2 years. And it would not be traced back to John. It got John to thinking. It would be easy to kill people who wouldn't be missed. John started stepping out on Veronica, and he would meet a woman named Elizabeth Harvey, who he began an affair with. He would actually have affairs with multiple partners, but it was Elizabeth who he could see having a future with. Elizabeth was divorced with kids, and one of her sons, Jamie Velasquez, would eventually be a loyal soldier to John. The strange thing about the Elizabeth situation was that John would tell his wife Veronica that Elizabeth would be moving into their home. He didn't really say much more to that, and Veronica accommodated this request. She didn't like it, but what was she going to do? That is what her strong-willed husband wanted. After some months, Veronica would just move out without saying anything, and she was officially replaced. Elizabeth and Jamie would soon see the real side of John, the murderous side, and they would be completely on board. After all, they were killing the common enemy. Just like Robert, Jamie had come from a home of abuse. It came at the hands of his father and sometimes his stepbrother. So when John would talk about predators being in the area and they deserved to be tortured and killed, Jamie was very receptive. But before taking human lives, they would hunt smaller prey. John would show Jamie how to kill stray animals until Jamie was comfortable doing it on his own. Jamie would perform with skill and efficiency, and John felt like a proud father. When Clinton's body was discovered and reported on the news, John admitted to Elizabeth that he was the one that killed him and that he was a pedophile. Elizabeth looked John in the eye and said, "Good on you, John." John was eager to find his next kill, and he wanted it to be a team effort. In December 1995, John had gotten word from neighbor Suzanne Allen that her tenant Ray Davies was a sexual deviant that preyed on children. Ray was mentally disabled, with the mindset of a child, and he had walked out of his room without pants on, while Suzanne's young grandchildren were there. The story would turn to Ray had exposed himself to them and tried to proposition the kids. John, Robert, Jamie, and Elizabeth would break into Ray's room one night to take him. At first, Ray smiled and laughed. He thought this was some kind of game. But when they got to John's house and John pulled out a bat, Ray's childlike happiness slowly turned to fear. John would hit him in the genitals over and over, calling him a child fucker. Ray couldn't comprehend why his friends were doing this to him. He would scream out in horror. The rest of them proceeded to torture the man, beating his chest, using pliers, and even a wrench on body parts. Even Elizabeth had joined in. In the end, Robert would use rope to hang Ray, and they were done. Another pedophile killed. This kill would have an added bonus to it for John. Ray's disability checks would still be delivered to Suzanne's address, and John had Suzanne wrapped around his little finger. Those funds would ultimately go into John's wallet. Suzanne must have known that John had something to do with Ray's disappearance, but she would keep it to herself. She would take it to her grave, which would happen a lot sooner than she would think. But why would John murder Suzanne? She wasn't a pedophile. He could argue she was weak, but I think the motive is a little more simple than that. Like Ray, Suzanne was unemployed and received a monthly disability check. With John not working, he had to have some income coming in from somewhere. And also, just like Ray, Suzanne would be another person that people wouldn't start really looking for. She had a falling out with her family, and so she disappeared one day, never to be seen again. John would decide to move to Murray Bridge, about 70 miles away from Adelaide, after he buried the bodies. John would use his good friend and neighbor Mark Hayden to secure the monies from the benefit checks in his own personal bank account. But a problem would arise from this. Mark had a wife named Elizabeth, who I will refer to as Beth, as to not confuse with John's love interest. Beth did not like her husband's friend John. She knew he was trouble. Beth was not easily manipulated, and she was very intelligent, and this would pose a huge threat to John. John didn't want the money to just sit and collect interest, so he started buying some property in a mostly vacant town called Snowtown, which was not too far from Salisbury North. It was in Snowtown where they would purchase a building that used to be a bank, and they would go on to use this building for very sinister purposes. As John and his crew would carry out more murders against sick pedos, they had to dispose of the bodies. The banks would have vaults downstairs underground, and they would use plastic barrels to contain the bodies of the ones they killed. And they would use acid to dissolve these bodies. John knew that he could never be charged with murder because there would be no bodies, or so he would think. And so John and his crew would start to go to work. John would use pedophile Barry Lane and loyal soldier Robert to gather intel on the streets of pedophiles that they could go after. They presented to John an openly gay teenager named Michael Gardner, who went by the name Michelle. Michael had started renting a room from an older woman after leaving home. His parents had not been accepting of him and his lifestyle. Now Michael was being kidnapped and electrocuted by the torturous bunch because John was convinced he was a pedophile, or future pedophile. They would kill him in Snowtown and put his body in an acid-filled barrel to dissolve. And John had learned beforehand that Michael was receiving benefit checks. John would need Michael's ID, but would soon learn that the young kid didn't have his wallet on him. This would pose a big problem. But as brazen as John was, he would later call the victim's landlady and try to convince her that Michael moved away. And he said he would need to stop by to pick up the wallet. The landlady wasn't falling for this though, and she had already reported Michael as missing to the police. Back in the community of Salisbury North, Barry Lane would meet a young 18-year-old kid, and the two of them would make something of an item together. The man's name was Thomas Trevelyan, and he wasn't in the military. But he liked to believe he was, dressing up in army fatigues, carrying a knife, and going on long marches. He was in great physical shape, but mentally speaking, Thomas would have episodes of paranoia and delusions. But Barry would see Thomas as his protector, and they would move in together. But what Barry didn't realize was that Thomas had been meeting with John and his crew in secret. And one night, Barry would be confronted by John, Robert, and Thomas. This would probably be John's favorite kill. He saw Barry as the guy who assaulted him when he was a little 8-year-old kid, and now he was dishing it out. He would crush Barry's toes with a set of pliers while administering electroshock. Barry had served his purpose by providing intel on pedos in the neighborhood, and now his time was up. Thomas had also served his purpose. His services would no longer be needed. Thomas would be seen as a joke to John, a delusional man who thought he was in the military. John and best friend Mark took him out to the woods one night, telling Thomas that sometimes a good general has to sacrifice himself. They forced him up on a wooden box while Mark put the rope around his neck. The body would be discovered soon after, and because of Thomas's history of mental issues, it would be ruled a suicide. John would not be suspected until a couple years later. They didn't have to accuse him of being a pedophile if people thought he died from suicide. The next kill would be a close friend of Jamie's named Gavin Porter. Gavin was a heroin addict, and by this point, so was Jamie. John saw the usage of drugs as weak. They were really no better than pedophiles in John's mind. But John was not about to kill his stepson. But Jamie had let Gavin move into their house without even officially asking John's permission. The kid was eating John's food, leaving his used needles all over the floor, and John wasn't going to allow this for very long. John would smile at Jamie and tell him it's fine, but later that day, John would call Robert to come over. They would take Gavin for a ride while he was passed out. The death was pretty brutal, with John pressing a tire iron against Gavin's throat until he choked to death. They had recently purchased a barrel and took the body to the bank. When John returned home and Jamie realized that Gavin was missing, he didn't even have to ask. He knew his friend was dead. But John would try to make it up to Jamie in his own convoluted way. Jamie's half-brother, Troy Yowd, had been invited by Elizabeth to live with them in September 1998. Jamie was pissed. This was the same brother that abused him as a child, along with his father. Troy had still been suffering abuse from Elizabeth's ex-husband, and Elizabeth felt bad for him, and that's why she invited him. But the fact that she would invite this guy threw Jamie into a rage. John took him aside and whispered in his ear, "This is your chance to get him back." And those words stopped Jamie in his tracks. Jamie would get even. And unsuspecting Troy had no idea he would be walking into his own death. When Troy arrived at his new home, he hadn't even had a chance to unpack fully when the Furious Four confronted him in the middle of the night. It was fearless leader John, accomplice Mark, and young former impressionable abuse victims Robert and Jamie. There may have been four, but Jamie did most of the work. Robert and Mark would hold Troy down while Jamie delivered blow after blow, letting out all the anger that had ate at him over the years. This was the ultimate revenge, and Jamie would dismember his brother afterwards before putting him in the barrel, but not before getting his ID in order to claim his benefit checks. John had been getting away with murder for 6 years at this point, but he still had to be careful. There were some people that knew too much, that he couldn't fully trust, so he would have to tie up some loose ends. Fred Brooks was Mark Hayden's nephew by marriage. He was aware of the benefit scheme his uncle was involved in, and Fred was of low intelligence. John was worried that he might talk and give all of them up. They couldn't take that chance. John and Robert would carry out the killing in Mark's home, dragging poor Fred out of bed and choking him to death. Mark would help dispose of his nephew's body. It was taken to Snowtown, where a barrel was waiting. Mark's wife Beth was growing very concerned. She was fully prepared to go to the police. She suspected that John was involved in murders throughout town, including her own nephew. She was worried about him continuing to kill people, and she grew increasingly concerned about her own well-being. Beth was very intelligent, unlike the people that John would brainwash and manipulate. She could see all the money going into the bank account that she shared with her husband. She figured she would go to the police first with this information. Maybe they could open up a fraud case against John. But on November 21st, 1998, John and Robert decided to pay Beth a visit in her home in the middle of the day. They let themselves in. Beth was startled, but she honestly didn't think they would do anything drastic. She even said to John, "You can't do anything to me, Mark won't allow it." To which John retorted, "Mark told us to do it." Those words might have well been serrated edges in her back. She didn't even try to put up a fight after hearing that. She was killed relatively quickly. After all, this was the wife of a good friend of theirs. Even though Mark gave the okay on this kill, he would never be the same after that, and he would fall into a deep depression. He had allowed John to convince him that this had to be done, and now the love of his life was gone. But unlike the others, Beth was not someone that could easily go missing and no one would take notice. She had a brother that she was very close with, and he was supposed to meet up with her the day that she was killed. Mark couldn't give any meaningful reason why she went missing, and her brother soon reported her to the police. The police opened up an investigation and started coming around, questioning Mark and John, and the police would not be going away. In the previous month, Gary O'Dwyer would fall victim to the group's greed. That's all it was by this point. Gary was not a pedophile in any way, shape, or form. He lived by himself and collected disability as a result of a car accident. Robert and John would befriend him after learning about him, and they would even case his house when he wasn't there. John and Robert surprised him at his house one night. John popped in a song by the band Live, which was sort of a ritual when they tortured somebody. He took delight in administering electroshock on the man, who was completely innocent. Jamie had another brother, a stepbrother named David Johnson. They got along really well as kids. David was just an all-around good guy, a nice guy, the kind of guy that John would see as weak. David had been in the market looking for a new computer, and Jamie volunteered his services, claiming that he knew where he could get a killer deal. David knew that his brother dabbled in low-level crime, so he thought it might be possible the computer was stolen that he was talking about. But he didn't ask, and he would meet up with Jamie where they would take a ride. They would end up at a bank in Snowtown. The bank in Snowtown. David thought this was very strange, but still, he would follow his brother down to the vault. This was his brother. He had no reason not to trust him. But when they got downstairs, a living nightmare would ensue. John and Robert would reveal themselves. John would grab David by the throat. David was straight, but John kept calling him a faggot as he cuffed his hands. He had to justify this kill somehow. It couldn't be motivated just by money, except it kinda was. That and just misplaced rage. And David had a nice cushy life. Jamie had been abused and now he was a junkie. It wasn't fair, and Jamie would use that as fuel to partake in this event. John turned on a tape recorder and forced David to say that he was gay and a pedophile, and that he was leaving Adelaide for good, and that he would not be in touch with anybody. After that, they got his bank card and they demanded his PIN number. Robert gave him a fake number because he figured they would kill him after they got the money, and he was trying to stall to buy some time, to try to figure out how to escape from this situation. But they wouldn't realize the number was a fake until later, after they tortured and killed him. And David wasn't on welfare, so they ultimately would get no money from him. It didn't totally bum John out though. He decided to cook parts of David while he was dismembering him. John and Robert would feast on David, but Jamie and Mark would not be interested in partaking in this. The investigation searching for Beth was underway. Beth's brother Garion was on a mission to find out what happened to his sister. He pointed the police in the direction of Mark and strongly advised him to look at his bank accounts. They would discover rent payments to an old bank in Snowtown, so they decided to go out there and investigate. On May 9th, 1999, they would find something there that they were not prepared for. They would find 8 bodies in 6 different barrels down in the vault. John and the crew thought that they had dissolved all the bodies, but they had actually purchased the wrong acid to use and ended up preserving the bodies instead. The police would also find a mountain of evidence at John's home, including rope and chemicals matching the kinds used in the barrels. They would also find the bodies of Ray and Suzanne back at John's old home. What would ensue would be the most sensational and longest murder trial in Australia's history. 12 murders were committed, but it was undetermined if John had murdered Suzanne. It could be plausible that she did die some other way before John dismembered and buried her. John Justin Bunting would be sentenced to 11 life sentences without parole. Robert Wagner would be sentenced to 10 life sentences without parole. Mark Hayden's trial was a little more complex because he was mostly portrayed as an accomplice after the fact. In the end, he would plead guilty to the assistance in the murder of his wife and nephew, and he was sentenced to 25 years, with no eligibility for parole until after 18. Jamie Velasquez was sentenced to 4 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 26 years. He was only convicted of 4 murders because he helped convict the others with his testimony. His picture has never been disclosed to the public, and he might walk free one day, which is kind of scary. So what did we learn? John was a man filled with hate, filled with rage. He carried that anger since he was 8 years old. But not every abused child grows up to be a murdering psychopath, so we can't really excuse him for his actions. It makes me wonder though in hindsight, if he told his parents what happened to him, if he got counseling, could he have ended up differently? Or was this something that had always just been inside him? He was preyed on as a kid, and he would grow up to prey on people as well. Not just his murder victims. He would also prey on the minds of impressionable people, including his co-conspirators. I think we all have anger and maybe hate towards pedophiles, but John's views were completely skewed. And if he wanted to take advantage of you, if he wanted to take your money, you were deemed a child rapist and was as good as dead. John is where he belongs right now, and so are the others.